Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. About 6 months ago, at 34, I finally saved enough to buy my first place. A small ranch-style house on Willow Drive in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. The house needed work, sure, with its peeling yellow paint and overgrown backyard. But after years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, having my own space felt like winning the lottery. I worked remotely as a technical writer for a software company, which meant I spent most days alone in my home office. Just me and my laptop and the occasional video call with colleagues scattered across different time zones. The solitude never bothered me. Actually, I preferred it that way, especially after going through a rough divorce the previous year that left me craving peace and quiet more than anything else. The closet thing started about 3 weeks after I moved in. Subtle at first, barely worth mentioning. Every morning when I woke up, the bedroom closet door would be cracked open maybe an inch or two, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Now this closet wasn't anything special, just a standard sliding door with those mirrored panels that made the small bedroom look bigger than it actually was. At first I blamed the house settling, or maybe the door wasn't properly aligned on its track, because old houses do weird things, right? But here's what got under my skin. I specifically remembered closing that door completely every single night before bed, pushing it firmly until I heard that little click that meant it was fully shut, because I had this thing about closed doors and organized spaces, probably from years of living in chaos with my ex who left everything open and scattered. Everywhere. After about a week of this morning routine, wake up, see the gap in the closet door, feel mildly annoyed, I decided to get serious about fixing it. I grabbed my toolbox from the garage, adjusted the rollers on the track, tightened every screw I could find, even sprayed some WD-40 on the mechanism for good measure. That night I made absolutely sure to close it tight, actually stood there for a solid minute watching to see if it would slide back open on its own, but nothing happened. The next morning, same damn gap, maybe even wider this time. Like whatever was causing this wanted me to know my little repair job meant nothing. I started taking photos with my phone each night after closing it and each morning when I found it open, creating this weird little collection of evidence that I wasn't going crazy. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early November, when I woke up and the door was open about 6 inches, wide enough that I could see into the darkness of the closet from my bed. Something about seeing that black gap in the morning light made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Like when you're a kid, and you're convinced something's hiding in the shadows but you're too scared to check. I actually called my buddy Nathan that afternoon, asked him if he wanted to come over for beers, and casually mentioned the door situation, hoping he'd offer some logical explanation I hadn't thought of. Nathan suggested maybe I was sleepwalking, getting up in the middle of the night to open it without remembering, which seemed reasonable enough except for one thing. I'd never sleepwalked in my entire life. Not once, and my ex would definitely have mentioned it during one of our many arguments if I had been wandering around at night doing weird stuff. That's when I decided to buy a camera, one of those small Wi-Fi enabled ones you can hide pretty much anywhere, because I needed to know what was happening in my bedroom while I slept. The guy at Best Buy recommended this tiny thing, barely bigger than a golf ball, that could record in night vision and save everything to the cloud automatically. I mounted it on top of my dresser behind some books, angled perfectly to capture both my bed and the closet door, then spent an embarrassing amount of time testing different positions to make sure it caught everything without being obvious. That first night with the camera running, I actually had trouble falling asleep. Kept staring at the closet door like it might suddenly spring open while I watched. But eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted off around midnight. My phone set to alert me if the camera detected any movement. The notification woke me at exactly 3:27 in the morning, my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. I grabbed it with clumsy fingers, still half asleep and confused, squinting at the screen that showed a motion alert from the bedroom camera. My heart started hammering as I opened the app, expecting to see myself sleepwalking just like Nathan had suggested, ready to laugh at my own paranoia, and maybe schedule a doctor's appointment to figure out why I'd suddenly developed this weird nighttime habit. But when the live feed loaded, I was still in bed, clearly visible in the grainy night vision footage, lying on my side facing away from the closet. The door, however, was moving, sliding open inch by inch with deliberate slowness, like someone was being extremely careful not to make any noise. I stayed perfectly still in bed, watching my phone screen while pretending to sleep, every muscle in my body tensed like a coiled spring. Through the camera feed, I watched the door continue its slow journey until it was open about 8 inches, and then I saw it. A hand, pale and thin in the night vision footage, fingers wrapped around the edge of the door from the inside. The hand just stayed there for what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, gripping the doorframe like it was testing, waiting, making sure I was really asleep. Then came the part that made me bite down on my tongue to keep from making any sound. A head emerged from the darkness of the closet, followed by shoulders, and I watched in absolute horror as a person, a grown man wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, slowly crawled out of my closet on his hands and knees, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had done this many times before. The intruder stayed crouched by the closet for several minutes, and through the camera I could see him watching my bed, his head tilted at an angle like he was listening to my breathing. He was skinny, probably in his 40s based on what I could make out, with scraggly hair that hung past his shoulders and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. Then he started moving around my room with disturbing familiarity, opening my dresser drawers just enough to peer inside, picking up items from my nightstand and examining them before placing them back exactly where they belonged. He went through my dirty laundry basket in the corner, actually lifted one of my worn shirts to his face, and I had to suppress the urge to jump up and confront him right then. But fear kept me frozen in place, unsure if he might have a weapon or what he'd do if cornered. After about 20 minutes of this nightmare, the man crawled back toward the closet, his movements just as careful and calculated as before. I watched him slide backwards into that dark space, pulling the door most of the way closed behind him, leaving it open just those familiar few inches that I'd been waking up to every morning. The realization hit me like ice water. This man had been living in my closet, coming out every night while I slept, going through my things, watching me, and who knows what else. My closet was deeper than standard. I remembered from the house tour. Something about it extending under the stairs, with that weird angular space in the back where I'd shoved some old boxes when I moved in. There was enough room back there for someone to hide, especially someone thin and flexible enough to contort themselves into that corner behind my hanging clothes and storage containers. I lay there until sunrise, unable to move, unable to think clearly, just watching that closet door through both my own eyes and the camera feed on my phone. When morning light finally crept through the windows, I carefully got out of bed, grabbed my car keys and wallet from the dresser, and walked straight out of the house in my pajamas and bare feet. I sat in my car in the driveway and called 911, told them everything while watching the front door of my house to make sure he didn't try to leave. The cops arrived within 10 minutes, 3 patrol cars with lights flashing, and I gave them my house keys and told them exactly where to look. They went in with guns drawn, shouting commands, and about 5 minutes later they walked out with the man in handcuffs, his head down, not resisting at all, just shuffling along like he was disappointed his secret had been discovered. The detective who took my statement later told me the guy's name was Leonard Briggs, a 51-year-old with a history of breaking and entering, trespassing and voyeurism charges going back 15 years. He'd been living in my closet for almost 2 weeks, surviving on food he'd steal from my kitchen during his nightly excursions. Apparently he'd been very careful to only take things I wouldn't notice. A handful of crackers here, a bit of lunch meat there, sips from different bottles so the levels wouldn't drop noticeably. They found his makeshift nest in that back corner of the closet, A sleeping bag compressed into a tiny bundle. Empty water bottles he'd pee in during the day when I was home. Protein bars, and a notebook where he'd been writing down my daily routine. When I showered, when I left for grocery runs, when I had video calls for work. The most disturbing part was a collection of my personal items he'd hoarded back there. A few unwashed coffee mugs I thought I'd misplaced, some underwear from my laundry, even my old work ID badge from the job I'd quit 6 months ago that I figured got lost in the move. Leonard had apparently done this before in other houses, the detective explained, picking homes with single occupants who worked from home, studying their patterns for weeks before making his move. He'd accessed my house through a basement window I didn't even know could open, had been living in my basement for days before discovering that perfect hiding spot in my bedroom closet where he could watch me more closely. They charged him with burglary, criminal trespass, and stalking, and he's currently serving a 5-year sentence, though I doubt that's enough to stop him from doing it again when he gets out. I moved out of that house the next week, didn't even go back to pack properly, just hired movers to grab everything while I waited outside. Now I live in a studio apartment with no closets at all, just open wardrobes and transparent storage shelves, and I sleep with every light on because I need to see every corner of my space at all times, need to know that I'm truly alone when I close my eyes at night. The house on Birchwood Lane caught my eye during a particularly rough patch in my life. 26 and fresh out of a messy breakup, I needed somewhere quiet to rebuild myself, somewhere that didn't echo with memories of shared meals and whispered promises. The realtor, a chatty woman named Gloria with hair the color of expired honey, mentioned the place had been empty for 8 months. She kept adjusting her oversized glasses while explaining how the previous tenants had broken their lease early, something about a job transfer to Seattle. The rent was surprisingly affordable for a 2-story house with original hardwood floors and a sprawling backyard that backed up to a wooded area. I signed the lease that same afternoon, ignoring the musty smell that seemed to seep from the walls and Gloria's nervous habit of checking her phone every few minutes. Moving in took me 3 days in early September, hauling boxes up those creaky stairs until my legs burned and my back screamed for mercy. The master bedroom had this beautiful bay window that overlooked the backyard, though the view was partially blocked by an enormous oak tree whose branches scraped against the glass whenever the wind picked up. I remember unpacking my kitchen stuff first, carefully arranging my grandmother's vintage plates in the cabinets and hanging my collection of mismatched coffee mugs on the little wooden rack near the stove. That first week felt like playing house, like I was pretending to be a real adult with a real life instead of someone whose entire world had crumbled just 2 months earlier. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. The Johnsons next door had twin boys who rode their bikes up and down the street every evening, and old Mr. Garrett across the way would wave from his porch where he sat smoking his pipe and reading newspapers until sunset. The first sign that something wasn't right came about 2 weeks after I'd settled in. I'd bought a whole rotisserie chicken from the grocery store on my way home from work. I was an administrative assistant at a medical clinic downtown. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I distinctly remember putting half of it in a Tupperware container for lunch the next day, even wrote Tuesday lunch on a sticky note, and slapped it on top. But when I opened the fridge the next morning, bleary-eyed and desperate for coffee, the container was there but completely empty, just a few grease stains on the bottom. I stood there in my pajamas, holding that empty container like it was some kind of puzzle piece that didn't fit. My first thought was that maybe I'd eaten it and forgotten. Maybe I'd had one of those midnight snacking sessions where you barely remember getting out of bed. But the chicken bones weren't in the trash, and I'd checked everywhere. Even the bathroom wastebasket, which made 0 sense, but my brain was grasping at straws. Then came the yogurt incident 3 days later. I'd splurged on this fancy Greek yogurt with honey and almonds, the expensive stuff in the glass jars that made me feel sophisticated. Bought 6 jars on Monday, ate one that night while watching reality TV, and judging people's life choices. Tuesday morning, only 3 jars left. Not empty this time, just gone, vanished like they'd never existed. The refrigerator light flickered when I stood there counting and recounting, as if it was mocking my confusion. I actually called my sister Katie in Phoenix, talking to her while I paced around my kitchen, opening and closing cabinets like the yogurt might be hiding behind the cereal boxes. She suggested maybe I was stress eating without realizing it, that the breakup was affecting me more than I thought. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they think you might be losing it, all gentle and measured like you're a spooked horse that might bolt. The lights were what really started to mess with my head. I'd wake up at random hours, 2 in the morning, 4:30, sometimes right around 3, and there'd be a glow coming from downstairs. Not every night, but often enough that I started keeping a notebook on my nightstand to track it. October 15th, kitchen light on. October 18th, hallway and living room. October 20th, just the lamp by the couch, the one with the crooked shade I kept meaning to fix. Each time I'd creep down those stairs, armed with a baseball bat I'd found in the garage, my bare feet silent on the cold wood. The house would be empty, of course, just me and my racing heartbeat, and the hum of electricity through old wiring. I'd turn everything off, double-check the locks, deadbolt, chain, even the little latch on the back door that led to the laundry room, then climb back to bed where I'd lie awake listening to the house settle, every creak and groan sounding like footsteps. Started to notice other things too, little details that made my skin prickle with unease. My shampoo bottle seemed to empty faster than it should, going from half full to nearly gone in just a few days, when typically a bottle lasted me 2 months. The laundry detergent too, I'd bought the jumbo size in early October, and by the end of the month it was down to the last few loads. Even weirder, sometimes I'd come home to find the toilet seat up in the downstairs bathroom, which made no sense because I lived alone and I'm meticulous about putting it down, a habit drilled into me by growing up with 3 sisters. Once I found a towel on the bathroom floor that I didn't recognize, this threadbare blue thing with a bleach stain shaped like Florida. I held it up to the light, trying to remember if maybe it came with the house, if Gloria had mentioned anything about leaving linens behind, but my memory came up blank. By the first week of December, I was barely sleeping. I'd installed one of those doorbell cameras even though the expense made me wince, and I obsessively checked the footage every morning. Nothing. Just the occasional cat slinking across the porch and leaves dancing in the wind. But the food kept disappearing. An entire loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter I'd just opened, even a whole package of deli ham that I knew I'd put in the meat drawer. I started taking photos of my fridge and pantry before leaving for work, comparing them when I got home like I was playing some twisted version of Spot the Difference. My coworker Janine noticed the dark circles under my eyes, kept offering me her concealer during lunch breaks. I wanted to tell her everything, but how do you explain that your house might be eating your groceries without sounding completely unhinged? The breaking point came 2 days before Christmas. I'd taken a week off work, planning to deep clean the house and maybe paint the spare bedroom this cheerful yellow color I'd seen in a magazine. But first, I decided to be smart about it. Ordered these motion sensors online, the kind that connect to your phone and alert you whenever they detect movement. Spent an entire afternoon setting them up, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the hallway, 2 in the living room, even 1 pointing at that back door to the laundry room. The guy at the electronics store had looked at me funny when I bought so many, probably thought I was paranoid about burglars. If only it were that simple. That first night with the sensors, I barely dozed off, phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Then, at exactly 3:07 in the morning, my phone exploded with notifications. Motion detected. Kitchen, motion detected. Hallway, motion detected. Laundry room. I called the police right then and there, whispering into the phone while I locked my bedroom door and shoved my dresser against it. The dispatcher, a woman with a smoky voice who sounded like she'd heard it all, told me to stay put and keep the door locked. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours as I sat on my bed, clutching that baseball bat and listening to every sound in the house. Officer Brennan was older, probably close to retirement, with gray stubble and eyes that looked tired even at 3 in the morning. His partner, Officer Diaz, couldn't have been much older than me, kept fidgeting with his radio while they searched the house. I watched from the top of the stairs as they went room by room, flashlights cutting through the darkness, checking closets and behind furniture. They found nothing, nobody, just an empty house with all the windows locked tight. Brennan suggested maybe it was mice or even possums that got in somehow, triggering the sensors, but I saw the look they exchanged, that universal expression of dealing with a hysterical woman who's probably imagining things. The next night, same thing. 3 in the morning, sensors going crazy. This time I had my phone recording video when the police arrived, showing them the timestamp, the pattern of movement from the kitchen through the hallway to the laundry room. Officer Diaz seemed more interested this time, asked if I'd noticed anything missing besides food. When I mentioned the toiletries and the strange towel, he wrote it all down in his little notebook, his pen scratching against the paper in the quiet house. They searched again, more thoroughly this time. Brennan even went into the basement, a creepy, unfinished space I'd avoided since moving in, full of old pipes and concrete walls that seemed to sweat moisture. Still nothing. But Diaz pulled me aside before they left, told me to call immediately if it happened again, gave me his direct number scribbled on the back of his business card. His hand lingered on my shoulder for just a moment, and I could see real concern in his eyes, not the dismissive look I'd gotten used to. The third night changed everything. Christmas Eve, and I was sitting in my living room with every light in the house blazing, drinking my 4th cup of coffee and watching the motion sensor app like it was the season finale of my favorite show. 3:02 in the morning, there it was. Kitchen sensor triggered, but this time I didn't call right away. I waited, watched the pattern. Kitchen to hallway, hallway to laundry room, then nothing for 5 minutes. Then the laundry room sensor went off again, stayed triggered for almost 30 seconds, like something was just standing there. That's when I called Diaz directly. He answered on the second ring, sounded wide awake like he'd been expecting my call, told me he was already on his way, to lock myself in the bedroom again. But I was done hiding. I stayed at the top of the stairs, recording everything on my phone, watching as Diaz and Brennan arrived with 2 other officers this time, their flashlights creating a light show through my windows. They went straight to the laundry room this time, like they'd been thinking about it, planning their approach. I heard Diaz calling out to Brennan, his voice sharp with excitement or maybe fear. Then more voices, urgent but controlled, the sound of furniture being moved. 20 minutes later, Diaz came up to get me, his face pale under the hallway light. They'd found it behind the washer and dryer, a hatch, painted the same faded white as the walls, with hinges so well oiled they didn't make a sound. Behind it was a crawl space that connected to the basement through a passage nobody knew existed, not mentioned in any of the house's documentation. Inside that space, they found a makeshift living area. Sleeping bag, canned goods, empty yogurt jars, my yogurt jars, lined up neatly against the wall. Water bottles, a battery-powered lantern, even a small mirror propped up on a milk crate. Whoever had been living there was gone, must have heard the sirens and escaped through the basement while the officers were coming through the front. The investigation revealed more than I wanted to know. The person had been coming and going through a broken ventilation grate in the basement that led outside, hidden behind overgrown bushes near the back of the house. They'd even fashioned a crude pulley system to move the grate from inside, explaining how they could come and go without leaving obvious traces. Detective Morrison, who took over the case after that night, found evidence suggesting someone had been using that crawl space for years, long before I moved in. There were date markings carved into the wooden beams, the oldest one from 2016, food wrappers stuffed into the walls, some so old they were practically fossilized. The previous tenants who broke their lease early. Morrison tracked them down in Seattle. They'd experienced the same things but convinced themselves they were going crazy, choosing to leave rather than dig deeper. Gloria, the realtor, claimed she knew nothing, But Morrison discovered she'd been giving discounts on the rent for years, cycling through tenants who rarely lasted more than 6 months. I moved out the day after Christmas, stayed with my sister Katie until I found a studio apartment downtown. Small, cramped, but entirely mine, with nowhere for anyone to hide. The police never caught whoever had been living in that crawl space. Morrison called me a few weeks later to say they'd found similar setups in 2 other rental properties in the state. Same careful construction, same pattern of coming out around 3 in the morning when people were in their deepest sleep. They think it might be the same person, someone who'd figured out how to exist in the spaces we don't think to look. I still check my motion sensors every night in my new place, even though there's literally nowhere anyone could hide. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, I wake up for no reason, my body trained to expect those notifications. I make myself get up, check the locks, peer into my tiny closet. Everything's always fine, always empty, always safe. But I keep checking anyway, because now I know that the spaces we think are ours might have room for someone else, someone patient enough to wait until we're asleep to live their parallel life in our homes. February in Colorado gets brutal. But that afternoon when I walked through the Victorian on Riverside Court, sunlight was streaming through those huge bay windows like the universe was trying to tell me something. My realtor Cheryl, this woman with hot pink nails who wore way too much perfume, kept checking her phone and rushing me through the tour, mentioning 3 other couples were coming to see it that same day. I was 31, had just finalized my divorce papers the week before, and desperately needed somewhere that didn't remind me of my ex-husband's cologne or his stupid baseball trophies. Original hardwood floors creaked under my feet as I explored each room, and that wraparound porch sealed the deal for me. What Cheryl didn't mention, what I had to find out later from the mailman, was that the previous owners had packed up in the middle of the night 3 months earlier, leaving half their furniture behind. The property management company had cleaned everything out, painted over whatever needed painting, but nobody in the neighborhood seemed to want to talk about why the Fosters left so suddenly. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and I threw myself into making that house mine with an energy I hadn't felt in years. The guest bedroom became my office, painted this soft sage green that reminded me of my grandmother's breakfast nook, where I used to do homework as a kid. Baxter, my golden retriever mix who usually acted like the world was ending every time a leaf blew past, actually started to calm down in the new space, stretching out on the kitchen tiles while I worked. Being a medical transcriptionist meant I could work from anywhere with decent internet, and the quiet neighborhood seemed ideal for concentration. My new neighbors waved from their driveways but kept their distance, suburban courtesy that suited me fine after months of friends trying to set me up with their cousins or co-workers. The street had this predictable rhythm that felt comforting. School bus at 7:30 sharp, mail delivery around 2, porch lights clicking on at dusk. For the first time since my marriage imploded, I could breathe without feeling like my chest might cave in. Everything changed on a Wednesday night, exactly 3 weeks after I'd moved in. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m. when I woke up to Baxter growling, this low rumble I'd never heard from him before. He was standing at the foot of my bed, rigid, staring toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. Then I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the back door. Not frantic pounding like someone in trouble, not the quick rap of a drunk person at the wrong house. These knocks had a rhythm to them, almost ceremonial. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. Each one seemed to echo through the house longer than it should have. Baxter's growl turned into a whine, and he backed up until he was pressed against my legs. I lay there, barely breathing, telling myself it was just tree branches or maybe a raccoon, even though I knew damn well neither of those things knock in perfect intervals. The knocking stopped after maybe 30 seconds, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed with every light in my bedroom on, Baxter curled up beside me, both of us jumping at every creak the old house made. When morning finally came, I checked the back door. Nothing disturbed, no footprints in the flower bed below the porch. No explanation for what we'd heard. I even asked my neighbor, Howard, this retired mechanic who seemed to know everything about everyone on the street, if he'd heard anything strange during the night. He just looked at me for a long moment, then muttered something about possums getting bold this time of year before hurrying back inside. The way he avoided eye contact made my skin prickle. That night, I double-checked all the locks, left the porch lights on, and went to bed hoping it was just a one-time thing, some teenager playing a prank or something equally harmless. 2 nights passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then Friday hit, and at 3:11 a.m. the knocking returned. This time it started at the back door, same slow, methodical pattern, but after 3 knocks it stopped. The silence stretched out for maybe 10 seconds, and just as I was starting to relax, 3 knocks came from the side of the house, right outside the dining room window. Baxter went absolutely ballistic, barking and snarling like I'd never seen, but he wouldn't leave my bedroom, wouldn't go investigate. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling as I tried to dial 911, but then the knocking moved again. 3 knocks at the front door, then silence, then 3 more knocks from the other side of the house near the kitchen. Whatever was out there was circling my house, knocking at different points like it was testing something, mapping the layout, learning the space. The pattern continued for almost 10 minutes. Back door, east side, front door, west side, over and over, before everything went quiet. I did call the police that time, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what happened without sounding completely unhinged. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later, did a perfunctory check around the property with their flashlights, and told me they didn't see anything suspicious. The younger one, Officer Valdez, seemed genuinely concerned and said they'd have patrol cars swing by more often. The older cop, though, kept exchanging these looks with his partner, like they knew something I didn't. Before they left, Valdez pulled me aside and asked if I'd considered getting security cameras. Said it real quiet, like he didn't want his partner to hear. The way he said it, urgent but careful, made me realize this wasn't the first time they'd been called to this street for something like this. That weekend, I drove 40 minutes to the nearest electronics store and bought 4 cameras, the best ones I could afford, determined to catch whatever sick person was doing this. Installing those cameras gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since the knocking started. My brother-in-law, Frank, came over Sunday afternoon to help set them up. 1 covering the back door, 1 on each side of the house, and 1 watching the front porch. The system connected to my phone so I could check the feeds any time, and it would send alerts for any motion between midnight and 6 a.m. Frank, bless him, didn't ask too many questions, just made sure everything was working and showed me how to save footage to the cloud. That first night with the cameras, I actually managed to sleep a few hours, feeling like I finally had some armor against whatever was happening. Monday passed peacefully, then Tuesday, and I started to think maybe whoever it was had seen the cameras and decided to find an easier target. I should have known better. Predators don't just give up when you make things slightly harder for them. They adapt, they wait, they find new ways to get what they want. Wednesday morning, 3:09 a.m., my phone exploded with motion alerts. I grabbed it with trembling fingers, pulled up the live feed, and there he was. A man in a dark hoodie, the hood pulled so far forward I couldn't see any features, just darkness where a face should be. He wasn't at the back door this time. The camera showed him standing in my backyard, maybe 15 feet from the house, perfectly still, facing the back door. He stood there for exactly 3 minutes. I know because I couldn't look away, couldn't even blink. Then he raised his right hand and knocked 3 times in the air, like he was knocking on an invisible door. The motion was slow, deliberate, exactly matching the rhythm I'd been hearing. Then he turned and walked to the east side of the house, disappearing from that camera's view. The side camera picked him up, showed him standing there, making the same knocking motion in the air. He continued this pattern, circling my house, stopping at each point where he'd knocked before, but never actually approaching the doors or windows, never touching anything. just standing at a distance, going through the motions, like he was rehearsing something or performing some kind of ritual. I called 911 while watching him circle my house for the third time, my voice high and panicked as I tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher kept asking if he was trying to break in, if he had any weapons visible, and I kept saying no, he's just standing there, knocking on nothing, please just send someone. By the time the police arrived 12 minutes later, the longest 12 minutes of my life, he was gone, vanished between one camera angle and the next, like he knew exactly where the blind spots were. Officer Valdez showed up again, this time with a detective named Reeves, who took everything much more seriously. They reviewed all the footage on my phone, copied the files, took down every detail I could remember. Detective Reeves kept pausing the video, zooming in, trying to get any identifying features, but the hood and the darkness made it impossible. She asked me if I recognized the build, the walk, anything about him, but all I could see was that deliberate, measured way he moved, like someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly what he was doing. Detective Reeves pulled me aside while Valdez checked the perimeter again and told me straight up that this behavior was escalating. She said the pattern, the testing, the circling, the way he never approached from the same angle twice, suggested someone who was studying my routines, learning when I was most vulnerable. She'd seen similar cases, she said, though she was careful not to give too many details. The way her jaw tightened when she talked about it told me enough. She gave me her direct number, told me to call immediately if anything else happened, and suggested I might want to stay with friends or family for a while. But where was I supposed to go? My parents lived 3 states away. My sister had a new baby and no room, and I'd just spent everything I had on this house. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom door, kept all the lights on, and sat up with Baxter, refreshing the camera feeds every few minutes, waiting for him to come back, because somehow I knew he would. People like that don't just stop. They escalate, just like the detective said. 3 nights later, he didn't come to my house. The motion alerts that woke me at 3:15 a.m. weren't from my cameras. They were from the app glitching, showing me static where the feeds should have been. I grabbed my phone to call Detective Reeves, but before I could dial, I heard sirens, lots of them, converging somewhere close. Baxter was pacing, whining, but not at my doors or windows. He kept looking toward the front of the house, toward the street. I crept to my front window, peered through the curtains, and saw police cars, ambulances, the whole circus, 3 houses down at the Andersons' place, the elderly couple who'd always waved when they walked their ancient beagle. My phone rang, Detective Reeves, and her voice was tight, professional, asking if I was okay, if my doors were locked, if I'd seen anything. She couldn't give me details, she said, but they needed my camera footage from the past week, all of it, immediately. The way she said it, I knew the Andersons weren't okay. I knew that whoever had been circling my house, learning my patterns, had moved on to an easier target when I'd made myself too difficult. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I'd basically pushed him toward my neighbors by installing those cameras, by being vigilant, by not being the easy victim he'd wanted. Detective Reeves called me 2 days later with an update I'll never forget. They'd caught him, not at the Andersons' house, but at another home 6 blocks away, caught in the act of trying to break in through a basement window at 3 a.m. The homeowner, a nurse who worked night shifts, had come home unexpectedly and called 911 when she saw him. His name was Russell Carpenter, 43 years old, lived alone in an apartment complex 2 miles away. When they searched his place, they found notebooks, dozens of them, filled with detailed observations about houses in our neighborhood, sketches of layouts, notes about routines, which houses had dogs, which had security systems when people left for work. My house had 16 pages dedicated to it. The Fosters, the family who'd lived there before me, had 12 pages, ending with a note that said, "Moved away," and the date they'd left. The detective said he'd been doing this for at least 2 years, maybe longer. 7 home invasions they could definitively link to him, all following the same pattern: the knocking, the circling, the studying, then striking when he'd learned enough, The Andersons had survived, barely, hidden in their bathroom while he ransacked their house. Detective Reeves said my cameras probably saved my life, that he'd clearly decided I was too risky after seeing himself on video. Russell Carpenter is serving 25 to life now, but I still wake up sometimes at 3 a.m., and I still check those cameras, because even though I know he's locked up, I can't shake the memory of watching him knock on invisible doors, practicing for the real thing. Two months ago, I finally closed on a house in Portland after my divorce papers went through. My brother kept joking that 34 was the new 21, trying to cheer me up about starting over. But the little ranch-style place on Oakwood Avenue actually did feel like the fresh start I desperately needed. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and retired folks who kept their lawns perfect and waved when you drove past. I'd been sleeping on my brother's couch for 6 months while the lawyers sorted everything out, so having my own space again felt incredible. The first week was all about unpacking boxes and trying to remember which one had the coffee maker. I'd taken a month off from my job at the architectural firm to get settled, and honestly just breathe for the first time in what felt like years. The house still smelled like fresh paint from where I'd redone the living room walls, and every morning I'd sit on the back deck with my coffee, watching the fog roll through the pine trees behind the property. The text started on a Monday morning, exactly 9 days after I'd moved in. I was making breakfast, just scrambled eggs and toast, when my phone buzzed on the counter. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, just a local area code I didn't recognize. The message read, "Nice blue flannel. The one with the small rip near the left pocket, you should probably sew that up." I looked down at my shirt, running my finger along the exact tear they'd described, a tiny hole I'd been meaning to fix for months. My first thought was that maybe it was someone from the moving company. They'd seen all my stuff, handled my clothes when they packed the bedroom. But something about the way it was written made my chest feel tight. I texted back asking who it was, but the response came immediately. "You burnt the toast. Better check the smoke alarm batteries while you're at it." The toast was indeed slightly blackened on one edge, still sitting on the plate next to the stove where I'd just pulled it out 10 seconds earlier. I walked to every window in the house, yanking the blinds closed hard enough that the plastic slats clattered against each other. The kitchen window faced the backyard, completely fenced in with a 6-foot privacy fence I'd specifically loved about the place. The living room had those big windows facing the street, but there were thick hedges along the sidewalk that the previous owner had let grow wild and tall. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see through the gaps in the leaves, but couldn't spot anyone out there. Another text came through. "The blinds won't help. You missed the small window in the hallway bathroom, the one with the frosted glass that you never thought anyone could see through." My legs felt weak as I practically ran to the hallway bathroom, and there it was. A narrow window up high that I'd completely forgotten about. The frosted glass doing nothing to hide the basic shapes and movements inside the house. The rational part of my brain kept trying to find explanations while I stood on the toilet lid, struggling with the old paint-sealed window lock. Maybe it was the previous owner playing some sick prank, or neighborhood kids with too much time on their hands. But kids wouldn't know about the shirt, wouldn't know these details. My phone buzzed again. "Your ex-wife had the same panicked look when she found those emails on your laptop." But we both know that wasn't really why she left, don't we? Everything in my body went cold. Nobody knew about the emails except me, Melissa, and our marriage counselor. The emails weren't even the affair she'd suspected, just me talking to a headhunter about job opportunities in California, planning to uproot our entire life without telling her. It was the betrayal of that secret planning that had really ended things, not the suspected infidelity she never found evidence of, because it never existed. I called the police immediately, but the officer who answered sounded like she was reading from a script when she explained they couldn't do much about non-threatening messages. The texts were creepy, sure, but there were no direct threats of violence, no explicit statements about harming me. She suggested I block the number and document everything, maybe file for a restraining order if I could figure out who was sending them. While I was still on the phone with her, another message popped up. Calling the police won't help. Officer Dana always says that, doesn't she? She's working the dispatch desk today because of her broken ankle. Skiing accident 3 weeks ago. I walked outside with the phone still pressed to my ear, looking up and down the empty street. The officer on the line was indeed named Dana, and when I asked about her ankle, there was this long, uncomfortable pause before she admitted she'd fractured it skiing in Montana recently. That's when the real panic started eating at me. This person knew things that required access to so many different parts of my life. My divorce documents, my daily routines, even real-time information about the police dispatcher. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with Verizon demanding they trace the number. The customer service rep kept transferring me to different departments, each one more confused than the last about what I was asking for. Finally, I got through to someone in their fraud department who took me seriously. He put me on hold for almost 30 minutes, and when he came back, his voice had changed completely. The number was registered to a prepaid phone, paid for in cash at a convenience store in my neighborhood 6 weeks ago. But here's what made him nervous enough to give me information he probably wasn't supposed to share. The phone's GPS showed it had been within a 3-block radius of my house for the past 9 days, basically since I'd moved in. The Verizon guy, his name was Anthony, started asking me these rapid-fire questions about whether I'd noticed any strange cars, any repair vans that stayed too long, anyone following me. He said they could narrow down the GPS ping to a more specific area if I wanted to file a formal request with law enforcement. While he was explaining the process, I grabbed my laptop and pulled up Google Maps, drawing mental circles around my house, trying to figure out where someone could park and still see into my windows. 3 blocks wasn't much in this neighborhood, mostly single-family homes with driveways, a few rental properties, and that small apartment complex on Cedar Lane that always had different cars coming and going. Anthony gave me a case number and said he'd personally flagged this for their security team. And that's when he mentioned something that made my whole body tense up. "Sir, the GPS shows the phone has been stationary for the last 4 hours. It hasn't moved from its current position since around 6 this morning." I looked at the clock on my laptop. It was already past 10 in the morning. This person had been sitting somewhere nearby for 4 hours, just watching, texting, knowing exactly what I was doing inside my own house. I grabbed my car keys and told Anthony I was going to drive around the neighborhood, see if I could spot anything unusual. He tried to tell me to wait for the police, but I was already out the door, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I drove slowly down each street in a 3-block radius, looking for anyone sitting in their car, any vans with tinted windows, anything that seemed wrong. On my second loop, I turned onto Sycamore Road, 2 streets over from mine, and that's when I saw it. A beige Toyota Camry with Oregon plates parked perfectly to have a clear view down the gap between 2 houses, straight into my living room window. The car was running, exhaust visible in the cool morning air, and I could make out the dark silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, holding something up to their face that looked like binoculars, or maybe a camera with a long lens. I pulled up behind the Camry and sat there for maybe 10 seconds trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to call 911 right then, but another part needed to know who this was, needed to see their face. I got out of my car slowly, my phone recording video in my jacket pocket, and walked toward the driver's side window. The person inside must have seen me in their side mirror because they suddenly lowered whatever they were holding and started fumbling with something in the passenger seat. When I got close enough to see inside, my brain couldn't quite process what I was looking at. It was a woman, probably in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing what looked like medical scrubs. She had this whole setup on her passenger seat, a laptop, multiple notebooks, what appeared to be printed photos of my house from different angles, and a telephoto camera. She looked at me through the window with these pale blue eyes that seemed completely calm, almost serene, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of this insane situation. Before I could say anything, she rolled down the window halfway and spoke in this soft, measured voice that sounded like she'd rehearsed it. "Hello, Brian. I was wondering when you'd find me. My name is Dorothy and I used to live in your house. Well, not your house exactly, the house that was there before they tore it down and built yours." She pulled out a folder from between the seats and held it toward me with steady hands. "I grew up there. Lived there for 43 years until the bank took it in foreclosure 5 years ago. My husband died in the room where your living room is now. Cancer. Took him 14 months to go, and I sat with him every single day in that exact spot where your television is." Her voice never wavered, never showed emotion, just stated facts like she was reading a grocery list. Inside the folder were old photographs of a completely different house. A 2-story colonial with white siding and green shutters, and dozens of pictures of her family throughout the years. Birthdays, Christmases, a wedding reception in what was now my backyard. She explained how she'd been working as a home health aide since losing the house, how she'd saved every penny to try to buy it back, but the developer got there first and demolished everything. She'd watched them tear it down from this exact spot on Sycamore Road, she said, counted every swing of the wrecking ball. The personal details she knew about my divorce came from a paralegal at my lawyer's office, where she'd done overnight cleaning shifts for extra money. She'd read through papers left on desks, memorized details about the new owner who would be living where her life used to exist. The thing about Officer Dana came from her police scanner app, which she listened to religiously, especially when it involved the neighborhood. She showed me notebooks filled with observations about everyone who lived within a 5-block radius, their routines, their visitors, their Amazon delivery patterns. It wasn't just me. She had files on all the neighbors, but I was special because I was living in her space, sleeping where her children had slept, cooking where she'd made 43 years of dinners. I stood there on Sycamore Road for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes. Listening to her calmly explain how she'd figured out ways to see into the house from various angles, how she'd tested different positions until she found the perfect spot. She talked about the bathroom window like it was her greatest discovery, how the frosted glass created shadows that let her track movement through the house. When I told her I was calling the police, she just nodded and said she understood, that she'd been expecting it since the day I moved in. While we waited for them to arrive, she asked if she could have one more look at the house just from the street, and something in her voice finally cracked. Not much, just a tiny tremor when she said the word, house. The police took her away quietly. No drama, no resistance. She was charged with stalking and harassment, and I got a restraining order that prevents her from coming within 500 feet of the property. But even now, 2 months later, I still check that bathroom window every morning, still feel exposed in my own living room, and sometimes I wonder if she's out there somewhere beyond that 500-foot line, still watching, still remembering the house that isn't there anymore. The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when I found the listing online. Scrolling through real estate sites at 2 in the morning with a glass of whiskey that had gone watery from neglect. My 37th birthday was coming up in a week, and here I was, starting from scratch after 15 years of marriage. The house caught my eye immediately, not because it was beautiful, but because it was absurdly cheap. A 3-bedroom colonial in Riverside Heights for barely $120,000, with recently remodeled, stamped across the listing like a promise. The photos showed fresh paint, new fixtures, even granite countertops in the kitchen. I scheduled a viewing for that weekend, figuring the worst that could happen was wasting a Saturday afternoon. The realtor, a woman named Candace with platinum hair and nails that clicked against her clipboard, met me at the property on a humid Saturday in July. She seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone and rushing through the tour like she had somewhere else to be. The house smelled like fresh paint and carpet cleaner, almost overwhelming in its intensity. Every room had been gutted and redone. New drywall, new floors, everything pristine and sterile like a model home. When I asked about the previous owners, Candace just shrugged and said something vague about a job relocation. The price was firm, she said, and they wanted a quick cash sale. No inspections, no contingencies. I should have walked away right then, but desperation makes you stupid, and I needed somewhere to live before my ex-wife's patience ran out. I moved in 3 weeks later with nothing but boxes and regret. The first few months were actually peaceful. The neighbors kept to themselves. The house stayed cool despite the August heat. And I started to think maybe I'd gotten lucky for once. I set up my home office in the smallest bedroom, hung my pictures in the hallway, even bought a grill for the backyard. The neighborhood was quiet, full of older couples and young families who waved politely but never stopped to chat. It wasn't until early January, when I was shoveling snow from the driveway, that everything started to unravel. An elderly man from across the street, Walter something, shuffled over with his own shovel and started helping without asking. We worked in silence for a while before he mentioned, almost casually, how nice it was to see someone finally living in the house again after what happened to the Millers. The Millers. I stopped shoveling and asked him what he meant, playing dumb even though my chest had gone tight. Walter leaned on his shovel, his breath coming out in white puffs, and told me how the Miller family, a couple in their 40s with 2 teenage kids, had lived there for 8 years before vanishing one weekend the previous March. No moving trucks, no goodbye parties, just gone between a Friday night and Monday morning. Their cars were still in the driveway for weeks until someone finally towed them away. Mail piled up until the post office stopped delivering. Walter said he'd called the police after 2 weeks, worried something had happened, but they just said the family had relocated and the house was being sold. The weird thing, he said while scraping ice from his shovel blade, was that nobody ever saw the house go on the market. One day there were contractors gutting the place, and a month later, I was moving in. That conversation haunted me for days. I tried calling Candace, but her number was disconnected. The real estate company she supposedly worked for had no record of her when I called their main office. My stomach churned as I pulled out my closing documents, spreading them across the kitchen table under the harsh overhead light. Everything looked legitimate at first glance. Signatures, notary seals, official letterheads. But when I started making calls to verify, nothing checked out. The notary license number didn't exist. The title company had no record of my transaction. The attorney listed on the papers had been disbarred 3 years ago. Even the bank account I'd wired my money to was registered to a shell company that dissolved the day after my payment cleared. I spent the next week diving deep into property records at the county courthouse, telling my boss I had the flu while I sat in that fluorescent-lit basement surrounded by dusty filing cabinets and ancient computers. The chain of ownership for my address was a maze of false leads and dead ends. According to official records, the Millers still owned the house. There was no transfer deed, no sale documentation, nothing. But when I dug deeper, even their ownership became questionable. The deed from when they bought the house in 2014 referenced a previous owner who, according to death certificates, had been dead for 6 years at the time of sale. Every document led to another impossibility, another person who didn't exist or couldn't have signed what they supposedly signed. The recorder's office clerk, a thin man with thick glasses who'd been working there for 20 years, pulled me aside one afternoon and whispered that he'd seen this pattern before, always with houses where families had vanished, always in different counties, but the paperwork followed the same template. The revelation that hit me hardest came when I found a cached version of an old real estate listing from 2008. The photos showed my house, but the interior was different. Not just furniture and decorations, but the actual layout. Rooms that didn't exist anymore. A basement entrance where my pantry now stood. Windows in places where I had solid walls. I printed everything and drove home in a daze, parking in my driveway as the sun set behind the identical suburban roofs. Inside, I walked through each room with the old photos in my hand, trying to match what I was seeing with what had been. That's when I noticed it. The dimensions were wrong. The house was smaller now, maybe by a third. Where had all that space gone? I grabbed a measuring tape and started checking walls, finding spots where the drywall sounded hollow in places that should have been exterior walls, places where the house should have ended but didn't. I became obsessed with the walls. Every night after work, I'd tap along them with my knuckles, listening for changes in sound, marking hollow spots with pencil. The master bedroom's east wall was the worst. It ran 15 feet longer than it should have according to the original blueprints I'd found. But from outside, the house looked normal. The math didn't work. I told myself I was losing it, that stress and paranoia were making me imagine things, but then I started hearing them, muffled sounds from behind the walls at night. Not mice or settling wood, but deliberate sounds, footsteps, breathing. Once I swear I heard someone crying, but it was so faint I couldn't tell if it was a child or an adult. I'd press my ear against the drywall and hold my breath, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds would stop the moment I got close, like whoever was there could sense me listening. 3 weeks into my investigation, I couldn't take it anymore. At 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, armed with a hammer and a flashlight, I went to the master bedroom's impossible wall. The first hit cracked the drywall. The second punched through and a smell hit me. Stale air mixed with something organic, like a closed room where someone had been living for too long. I pulled away chunks of drywall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind it was another layer of wall, older, with faded wallpaper showing tiny yellow roses. I kept going, demolishing a section about 2 feet wide, until I found it, a door, painted over so many times it almost blended with the wall. The doorknob had been removed, leaving just a hole filled with plaster. I clawed at the paint around the edges until I could get my fingers in the gap, and pulled. The door opened inward with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow hallway that shouldn't exist. The hallway stretched about 20 feet, lit by a single bulb that somehow still had power. The walls were covered in that same rose wallpaper, but sections had been torn away, revealing messages scratched directly into the drywall underneath. Names and dates going back decades. The Robertsons, 1987-1991. Jennifer and Kevin Huang, 1995-1999. The Millers, 2014-2023. Each family name I recognized from my research, people who had supposedly sold their houses and moved away. At the end of the hallway were 3 doors. The first opened to a small room with a chemical toilet, packages of food and water bottles, some empty, some still sealed. The second room had 4 mattresses on the floor, blankets neatly folded at the foot of each one. Children's toys were scattered in one corner, including a stuffed elephant with one eye missing. The third door was locked from the outside with a padlock that looked brand new. Behind it I could hear movement, shuffling feet, whispered voices that went silent when I touched the lock. I ran back through the hidden hallway, stumbling over my own feet, and grabbed bolt cutters from my garage. When I returned and cut the lock, the door swung open to reveal 4 people huddled in the corner of a windowless room, a man and woman in their 40s, and 2 teenagers, a boy and girl. They were thin, pale, wearing clothes that had been washed too many times. The woman started sobbing when she saw me. They were the Millers. They'd been living in the walls of their own house for almost a year, moved from room to room through a network of hidden passages, by someone who came every few days with food and water, someone who wore a mask and never spoke. The same person who'd approached them one night with a gun, forced them into the walls, then renovated their house around them, sealing them inside. They'd heard me living in their house, heard me watching TV in what used to be their living room, heard me on phone calls in their kitchen. They'd been too terrified to make noise because he'd threatened to kill them if anyone found out. But lately, they'd been getting desperate as the food deliveries became less frequent. I called 911 immediately, but even as I explained the situation, I knew how insane it sounded. The police arrived within minutes, followed by ambulances and what seemed like every news van in the state. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of properties across 6 states with similar hidden spaces, some still containing families who'd been missing for years. The person orchestrating it all was never caught. The fake documents were so sophisticated that federal investigators suspected multiple people were involved. Someone with access to government databases, someone in real estate, someone in construction. The Millers were relocated into witness protection after receiving death threats, and I moved out that same week, staying in hotels until I could find a legitimate apartment. The house on Riverside Heights was torn down a month later, revealing an elaborate maze of hidden passages between the walls. Sometimes I still wake up at night, wondering if the apartment I'm renting now has hollow spaces behind its walls, if someone might be living just inches away from where I sleep, watching, waiting, preparing documents with names that don't exist for the next person to move in. The lease paperwork showed my birth date clear as day, April 1989, which meant I'd turned 34 just weeks before signing. 34 and finally living alone for the first time in my life, if you can believe that. I'd spent years bouncing between roommates, then moved back home after my dad got sick, and by the time he recovered, I was desperate for my own space. The rental on Willow Creek Lane wasn't much. A small 2-bedroom cottage with peeling yellow paint and a chain-link fence. But it was mine. All mine. The landlord, Mr. Castellano, seemed nice enough during the showing. Older guy, maybe in his 60s, with reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck, and a habit of jingling his keys while he talked. He told me he owned 4 properties in the area, all single-family homes he rented out to nice, quiet folks. I signed the lease that same afternoon, handed over first and last month's rent, and got my keys on a worn brass ring with a little blue tag that said Unit C, even though there was no Unit A or B anywhere in sight. The weirdness started small, the kind of thing you talk yourself out of noticing. I'd come home from my job at the veterinary clinic. I'm a vet tech, been doing it for about 9 years now, and the kitchen light would be on. Not a big deal, right? Maybe I'd left it on that morning in my rush to get out the door, but then it happened again. And again. Always the kitchen light, that ugly fluorescent fixture that buzzed like an angry wasp. I started making a point to check before I left, even took a photo on my phone one morning to prove to myself I'd turned it off. When I came home that evening, it was blazing bright again. Then I noticed the deadbolt. I'm obsessive about locking up. Always have been ever since my apartment got broken into back in college. So I know for a fact I turn that deadbolt until it clicks. But I'd put my key in the lock and feel it turn just a fraction before catching, like someone had left it not quite locked. Just slightly turned back, maybe a 1/4 inch from fully engaged. It made this weird grinding sound, metal on metal, that set my teeth on edge every single time. I called Mr. Castellano on a Wednesday morning, trying to keep my voice casual even though my heart was doing this annoying flutter thing in my chest. Hey, just wondering, has anyone been coming by the house? Like for inspections or anything? There was a pause, then that jingling sound of his keys in the background. Oh, sure, he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That's just Vincent, my maintenance guy. He checks the furnace filters, looks for leaks, that sort of thing. Standard stuff. I should have mentioned it in the lease, my apologies. He laughed, this wheezy sound that crackled through the phone. Vincent's been working for me for 15 years. Good guy. Very thorough. He has keys to all my properties. Something about the way he said very thorough made my stomach feel weird, but I thanked him and hung up. It made sense, I guess. Landlords did that kind of thing. Still, I wished he'd given me a heads up, maybe a schedule of when this Vincent guy was coming by. But the lights kept happening, and not just the kitchen anymore. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning to use the bathroom and see a glow coming from under my bedroom door. The hallway light blazing bright. I lived alone. I knew I hadn't gotten up and turned it on. One night I found the lamp in the living room on. The one by the bookshelf that I never used because it had this ancient bulb that flickered and gave me a headache. It was on when I came home from a late shift, throwing these weird shadows across the wall that looked almost like someone standing there. I checked every window, every door. Nothing seemed forced or broken. Everything locked up tight from the inside. I started keeping a log on my phone, just noting down every time something was off. March 15th, kitchen light on, deadbolt loose. March 18th, hallway light on at 2 a.m. March 22nd, living room lamp on, back door lock felt weird. I didn't know what I was going to do with this information, but it made me feel slightly less insane to have it written down somewhere. Then things got worse in a way that's hard to explain without sounding paranoid. Objects started moving. Not dramatically. I'm not talking about chairs stacked on tables or anything like that, but small things. My coffee mug, the blue one with the chipped handle that I always left on the right side of the sink, would be on the left. The throw pillows on my couch, which I arranged the same way every day, 2 on the left, 1 on the right, don't ask me why, it's just what I do, would be rearranged. 2 on the right, 1 on the left. The bathroom door, which I kept closed because the mirror inside faced my bedroom, and it creeped me out at night, would be standing wide open. I'd close it before bed, and by morning it was open again. My toothbrush moved from one side of the sink to the other. A framed photo of my dog Pepper, she died 2 years ago, still miss her like crazy, kept getting turned face down on my nightstand. That one really got to me. I'd stand it back up, and the next day it would be face down again, like someone was deliberately trying to mess with me. I called Mr. Castellano again, this time not even trying to hide the edge in my voice. I need Vincent's schedule, I told him. I need to know exactly when he's coming by because things are being moved in my house and it's freaking me out. Another pause, more key jingling. Moved? What do you mean moved? He sounded genuinely confused, which somehow made it worse. I explained about the lights, the locks, the objects. He made this sympathetic humming noise. Honey, old houses settle. Doors swing open on their own. You probably just forgot where you put things. Happens to me all the time. I wanted to scream that I wasn't some scattered airhead who couldn't remember where she put her own coffee mug, but instead I just asked again about Vincent's schedule. He doesn't really have one, Mr. Castellano said. He just swings by when he's in the area. Could be morning, could be afternoon. I'll tell him to maybe leave you a note next time, how's that? It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I didn't know what else to say, so I just agreed and hung up. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house settling made me sit up in bed, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for the handle to turn. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in early April. I'd worked a double shift at the clinic. We'd had an emergency surgery on a Great Dane who'd eaten a bunch of socks, real mess, and I was absolutely exhausted. The kind of tired where your bones ache and your eyes feel like sandpaper. I came home around 11, threw my scrubs in the hamper, took the quickest shower of my life, and fell into bed without even checking my phone. I was asleep within minutes. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not suddenly, not from a noise. Just that weird sense that something was different, that the air pressure in the room had changed somehow. My eyes opened and I lay there in the dark, perfectly still, listening. The house was silent. Not even the hum of the refrigerator or the tick of the heating vent. Just pure, heavy silence that felt like it was pressing down on my chest. And then I heard it. The softest sound, barely there. Breathing, not my breathing. Someone else's breathing, slow and steady, coming from somewhere near the foot of my bed. My entire body went rigid. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just lay there, straining my ears, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But I wasn't. The breathing continued, patient and unhurried, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. I don't know how long I lay there, could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. Time did this weird, stretchy thing where every heartbeat felt like an hour. The breathing eventually stopped, and I heard the faintest whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against fabric. Footsteps, so quiet I almost missed them, moving away from my bed toward the door. The click of my bedroom door closing, so gentle it barely made a sound. Then nothing. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to move. my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought I might pass out. When I finally reached over and turned on my bedside lamp, my hands were trembling so badly I almost knocked it over. The room was empty, door closed, everything exactly as it should be. But on my dresser, the little jewelry box I kept there, my grandmother's antique one with the painted roses, was open. I never left it open, ever. Inside, my necklaces were tangled together in a way they hadn't been before, like someone had been running their fingers through them. I grabbed my phone and sat with my back against the headboard until the sun came up, lights blazing in every room, checking the lock on my bedroom door every few minutes, even though I knew it didn't have one. The next morning, I didn't call Mr. Castellano. I didn't trust him anymore. Didn't trust his excuses about Vincent or settling houses or my own faulty memory. Instead, I drove to a Best Buy 30 minutes away and bought a hidden camera. One of those little wireless ones that looks like a phone charger and connects to an app on your phone. Cost me almost $200. Money I really didn't have, but I didn't care. I needed to know. I set it up on my dresser that afternoon, angling it toward my bedroom door so it would catch anyone coming in. The app would send me a notification if it detected motion, and it recorded everything to a cloud server. I tested it a few times, walking in and out of frame, watching the footage on my phone. Perfect. Crystal clear, even in low light. That night I went through my normal routine. Dinner, shower, double-checked every lock in the house, but instead of going to bed I took 2 Benadryl to knock myself out. I know that sounds stupid, making myself unconscious when I was scared someone might come in, but I needed them to think everything was normal. I needed them to show up, and I needed proof. The notification woke me up at 1:47 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with the alert, motion detected in bedroom. My pulse started racing immediately, that horrible adrenaline dump that makes your whole body feel electric. I opened the app with shaking fingers. Okay, my hands were shaking, I'll admit that, and watched the live feed. The angle showed my bedroom door, and as I watched, the handle turned, slowly, carefully, like someone was trying not to make noise. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside. The video quality was good enough that I could see details even in the darkness. It was a man, average height, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. But here's the thing that made my throat close up. It wasn't some stranger. It was Mr. Castellano, my landlord. The same guy who'd been telling me it was just Vincent, the maintenance man. He stood in my doorway for a few seconds, completely still, just looking into my room. Then he stepped further inside, moving with this careful precision that told me he'd done this before. Many times before. He walked to the side of my bed, my side, the left side where I was currently pretending to be asleep, and just stood there, watching me. I could see him on my phone screen, this dark silhouette looming over where I lay, and I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound. He stood there for what the timestamp later showed was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 4.5 minutes of him just standing beside my bed, staring down at me while I pretended to sleep. At one point, he leaned down slightly and I swear I could feel the displacement of air near my face. My eyes were squeezed shut under the blanket, my breathing measured and slow even though my heart was trying to pound its way out of my chest. Through my phone screen, which I had tilted just enough to see while keeping it hidden under my pillow, I watched him reach out. His hand hovered over my hair, which was spread across the pillow, and for a horrible second I thought he was going to touch me. But he pulled back. He straightened up, turned slowly, and walked to my dresser. The jewelry box. He opened it. That same painted rose box, and I watched him sift through the necklaces, picking up a silver chain my mom had given me for my 21st birthday and holding it up to what little light came through the window. Then he put it back, closed the box, and moved to my closet. He opened the door, which I always kept closed, and just stood there looking at my clothes for another minute. The whole time, his movements were casual, unhurried, like he was browsing a store, like he had every right to be there. Finally, he walked back to the door, paused to look at me one more time, and left. I heard the soft click of the front door lock engaging a minute later. I waited until I saw his car pull away. I jumped up and looked out the window, watched his old Buick sedan disappear down Willow Creek Lane before I let myself fall apart. I sat on my bathroom floor and cried for 20 minutes straight, that ugly kind of crying where you can't catch your breath and your whole face gets splotchy. But then I stopped. I washed my face, drank a glass of water, and got angry. Really, truly angry. That footage was saved to the cloud. I had him. Clear as day, breaking into my house, standing over me while I slept. I downloaded the video file, backed it up in 3 different places, and at 8 a.m. sharp, I walked into the police station 2 blocks from the clinic. The officer who took my report, Officer Huang, this young woman who couldn't have been more than a few years out of the academy, went pale when I showed her the footage. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, watching Mr. Castellano loom over my bed. "How many times do you think he's done this?" I showed her my log of all the lights and moved objects going back to mid-March. "At least 20 times, I said, maybe more before I started keeping track. They arrested him that afternoon. Turned out I wasn't the first tenant to complain about weird things happening, but I was the first one with proof. When they searched his house, they found keys to all his rental properties, labeled and organized in a drawer. They also found photos. Polaroids of women sleeping. Different women, different rooms, but all the same terrible violation. The prosecutor told me later there were pictures going back at least a decade. I moved into that apartment with a sense of relief more than excitement. After a messy breakup, I just wanted somewhere quiet, a place where no one knew me, where I could close the door and not think about anyone else's noise or drama. It was a small 2-bedroom unit in an old building on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner even after you'd been there for a week. The landlord, a polite older man named Harold, had seemed straightforward. He handed me the keys, made a few jokes about the quirky plumbing, and wished me luck. I remember thinking he looked tired but harmless. The first few nights were normal enough. I unpacked, worked remotely, and tried to make the space feel mine. The walls were painted a flat beige, the kind that hides cracks if you do not look too closely. I hung string lights, set up my laptop on the kitchen table, and streamed old sitcoms to keep the silence from feeling too heavy. But something about the apartment stillness began to gnaw at me. Every creak in the ceiling sounded deliberate, like the wood shifting just a little too rhythmically, as if reacting to my movements. By the end of the first week, I noticed something strange near the vent above my bed. It was a tiny mark, smaller than a grain of rice, right at the edge of the metal slats. I thought it was just a nail hole or maybe a dent from a screwdriver. But when I looked closer, it was perfectly circular. A little too clean. My stomach tightened as I leaned closer and saw a dark dot in the center, like the lens of a camera. I laughed out loud at myself for even thinking that. Who would hide a camera there? Still, once the idea lodged itself in my head, it would not leave. 2 days later, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a screwdriver and decided to check one of the light switch plates in the hallway. That's when I noticed the same kind of hole just above the screw, a pin-sized opening that looked identical to the one by the vent. I hesitated for a long moment, standing there barefoot in my hallway, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But I unscrewed the plate anyway. Behind it was a thin wire, black and almost invisible against the drywall. It ran upward into the wall cavity. My hands felt clammy. I followed the wire as far as I could without breaking anything, and it disappeared straight into the ceiling. I could not stop thinking about that wire. The next morning, I borrowed a stepladder from my neighbor, a friendly woman named Denise who lived across the hall. She laughed when I said I needed it to check something weird in the ceiling, probably assuming it was a light fixture problem. When I climbed up and opened the narrow attic hatch above the hallway, a gust of warm, stale air hit me. The smell was awful, like old insulation and something metallic. I pulled my phone's flashlight app on and aimed it around. That was when I saw it. A small device taped near the vent shaft, with a faint red light blinking once every few seconds. At first, I thought it might be part of the building's security system. But as I got closer, I saw the thin antenna and a label with a Wi-Fi network name printed in tiny letters. The name didn't match my router or any neighbor's connection I recognized. My heart began racing. I gently pulled the tape back and revealed a pinhole-sized camera lens attached to a transmitter the size of a deck of cards. There was dust around it, but it looked far too new to belong in an attic like that. Someone had put it there deliberately. I spent the rest of the day spiraling between disbelief and panic. Every vent, every outlet cover, every smoke detector suddenly felt like a threat. I tried to tell myself it was some weird leftover security setup from a previous tenant. But when I emailed the property manager, they told me the building didn't even have central surveillance. That night, I barely slept. I unplugged my Wi-Fi, turned off every light, and sat in the dark with my phone flashlight aimed at the ceiling. Every sound, pipes clicking, the refrigerator cycling, made me flinch. The following morning, I called the police. 2 officers arrived within an hour, one of them carrying a small inspection camera. They went through the attic and my walls more carefully than I had. When they came down, they looked disturbed. One of them said quietly, "Ma'am, there are multiple devices up there." They counted 6 tiny cameras, all hidden behind vents and light fixtures. Each one was wired to a transmitter pointed toward the street. They said the signal likely bounced to a nearby receiver. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, clutching a coffee mug just to keep my hands occupied, while they made calls for a warrant. They came back later that evening with a detective and a technician who specialized in digital forensics. The technician carried a small scanner and a portable monitor. He climbed into the attic again, and within minutes he called down that the devices were broadcasting an open feed. When he patched into the signal, the detective's expression hardened. The live footage showed my bedroom. The bed, the dresser, the nightstand, everything. My knees went weak. The technician muted the screen quickly, but the image burned into my head. I had been living there for nearly 3 weeks. The next few hours felt surreal. They traced the Wi-Fi transmitters and determined the signal had been routed through a small server found behind a wall panel in the basement. It wasn't connected to the building's main network. It had its own separate line running outside the property. The detective asked if I had any information about the landlord before Harold. That was when I remembered. The previous owner had passed away, and Harold had been managing the property for only a year. The detective exchanged a look with his partner and told me they'd need to bring him in for questioning. The building was treated as a crime scene for 2 days. I stayed with a friend across town while investigators removed drywall and collected the hidden devices. Every new discovery made the situation worse. They found microphones too, tucked behind wall outlets and vents. Apparently, the footage had been streaming to a private server that linked to a subscription-based website. The detective later told me that some of the recordings had timestamps going back months before I even moved in. I could not wrap my head around it. How many people had lived there unaware? When Harold was finally arrested, it barely felt real. He had admitted to installing the equipment himself, claiming it was for security reasons. But the footage told a different story. Investigators said he'd been watching tenants for entertainment and selling access to the feed online. The thought of strangers sitting somewhere, watching me sleep, watching me change clothes, made me nauseous. The apartment no longer felt like a place I had lived in. It felt like a set, a stage. Every moment of privacy had been a lie. I eventually had to go back to pack my things. Even though the police had already cleared the place, I could not bring myself to be alone inside. Every time I stepped through the door, it felt like eyes were still hidden somewhere behind the walls. I remember moving in silence, stuffing clothes into boxes as quickly as possible. The vents, the light switches, even the mirror in the bathroom made my skin crawl. When I finally locked the door for the last time, it was like shutting a chapter I wanted to erase but never could. The detective called me a few weeks later to update me. They had traced the streams to several online forums where Harold had uploaded live feeds under fake usernames. Some of the viewers had even paid him through cryptocurrency. He faced multiple charges, including invasion of privacy and illegal surveillance. Hearing that gave me a strange mix of anger and vindication. It was horrifying, but at least it meant someone was finally being held accountable. I still check my ceiling vents in every new place I live. I can't stop myself. Even now, I catch myself thinking about all the moments that camera must have seen. The phone calls I made to my mother, the nights I cried after work, the times I danced around the kitchen while cooking, moments that were supposed to be mine. It's strange how easily trust can be destroyed by something you can't even see. I learned more about paranoia in that 1 month than I had in my entire life. Sometimes people on forums ask me why I didn't notice sooner, how I could have missed something like that. The truth is, you never imagine your home being a stage for someone else's entertainment. You never think to question the silence or the air vent above your bed. But once it happens to you, once you've lived inside that kind of invasion, you never unsee it. Even when I close my eyes, that little red light in the attic still blinks in the dark. When I first bought the old place on Brookside Lane, I thought I'd gotten lucky. It was a one-story house from the 1960s, recently restored but still had that quiet charm. Wood paneling in the living room, mint green tiles in the kitchen, and a faint smell of cedar from the closets. The previous owner had passed away years earlier, and the house sat empty until a small company flipped it. It felt solid, clean, and strangely peaceful. The kind of place you settle into after a long stretch of bad apartments. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly normal. I had gone down to the city office to get some of the old blueprints, just out of curiosity. I wanted to know how the wiring was laid out because I planned to add recessed lights in the hallway. The clerk printed out a copy for me and even joked that I was brave to live in one of those relics. I unfolded the blueprints at my kitchen table that night and immediately noticed something strange. According to the diagram, the house was supposed to have 4 bedrooms, not 3. The extra one was marked right between the hallway bathroom and the guest room, but there was nothing there in real life except a long stretch of wall. At first, I assumed it was just an old plan. Maybe the layout changed during renovations decades ago. Still, it bothered me. I walked down that hallway with the blueprint in hand, measuring the distance between the doors. The math did not add up. There was a solid 6-foot gap that led nowhere. The wall in that section felt different. The paint was newer, smoother, like it had been redone recently. I knocked once, then again, and the sound that came back wasn't the solid thud of drywall backed by studs. It was hollow, deep, and echoing, like the other side was empty. That was the moment a weird kind of curiosity took hold. I grabbed a flashlight and a small hammer, thinking I'd just open a small hole to check. The first tap cracked the paint, and a small puff of dust fell out. I made a fist-sized opening, shone the flashlight through, and saw tiles. White tiles. I could tell from the shine that it was some kind of bathroom or laundry area, but the blueprint had listed it as a bedroom. That inconsistency set my nerves on edge. Still, I kept going, widening the hole until I could squeeze through. The air inside that hidden space was heavy, like it had been sealed for decades. My flashlight beam caught dust swirling in the air, and I realized the room was smaller than expected, barely big enough for a single bed and a small nightstand. The tiles covered not just the floor but halfway up the walls, the kind you'd see in old hospitals. Some of them were cracked and discolored. When I stepped in, the echo of my own movement bounced weirdly around, like the sound had nowhere to escape. It gave me a strange sense that the place had been meant to contain something, not just house it. The strangest detail was a metal bracket on the wall, right where a bed's headboard would have gone. The floor beneath it had dark stains, faded but clearly there, spreading out in irregular shapes. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe paint, maybe rust. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I crouched down and noticed tiny fragments stuck in the grout, dark reddish-brown that had turned almost black. The smell there was faint but distinct, a sour metallic trace that no renovation could have completely erased. Then I noticed the camera. It was small, old-fashioned, the kind with a thick lens and a wire running behind the tiles into the wall. It pointed directly toward the spot where the bed had once been. I remember standing there, staring at that lens for a long time, like I expected it to suddenly blink to life. My flashlight caught a faint engraving on the camera's metal frame. Security Vision 1984. It wasn't a modern installation. Someone had put that there long before the house was ever flipped or repainted. I pulled back, uneasy now, and started searching for where the wire led. It disappeared behind a false panel near the floor. When I pried it open, I found an old junction box with 2 disconnected cables and a stack of yellowed photos wrapped in plastic. My hands hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. The photos showed that same room, same tiles, same bracket, but with a bed in place and a person lying on it. The images were grainy and colorless, but one thing was clear. Whoever took them had been watching, not documenting. I backed out of that room and sat on the hallway floor for what felt like hours. Every sound in the house suddenly seemed sharper. The creak of wood, the hum of the fridge, even the faint wind outside. I sealed the opening with a tarp that night, too unsettled to look at it again. I called a friend, Caleb, who worked in construction, and asked him to come by the next morning. I did not tell him everything, just that I had found a hidden room. He laughed at first, said old houses always had weird surprises. That laugh faded the moment he stepped inside and saw the stains. Caleb wanted to take the camera apart, but I stopped him. I felt like disturbing anything else would somehow make things worse. We ended up patching the wall temporarily, covering the entrance with a sheet of plywood until I decided what to do. That night, I slept in the living room with every light on. Around 3 in the morning, the smoke detector started beeping, the low battery kind of sound. But when I climbed on a chair to remove it, I realized it wasn't the detector at all. The sound was coming from inside the wall, near where the hidden room was. The next day, I hired an electrician to trace the old wiring. He found that one of the cables from that sealed space connected to an outlet behind my bedroom dresser, a hidden line that shouldn't have existed. He said it looked like someone had tapped into the power decades ago, possibly to run surveillance equipment. That same afternoon, I went back to the city office and asked about the previous owner. The file showed the name Evelyn Morris. She had lived there from 1967 to 1994, then vanished from local records. No sale, no forwarding address, nothing. The clerk said it was probably a clerical error. It did not feel like one. I moved out 2 weeks later. The real estate agent asked why I was selling so soon, and I just told her I was relocating for work. A few days before I left, I walked through the house one last time. The plywood over the wall looked harmless, almost neat, like it belonged there. But as I turned off the lights and closed the front door, I heard something faint from the hallway. A quiet click, like an old camera shutter being pressed once. I never went back. Buying that old house felt like the best decision I had made in years. I wanted a project, something to keep my mind busy after the divorce, and the place had charm even beneath the dust and peeling paint. It was a 1-story ranch house on the edge of town, the kind of property realtors describe as having good bones. The kitchen, though, was a nightmare. Dark cabinets, yellow linoleum, and a faint smell of mildew no matter how much I scrubbed. I spent most evenings after work tearing out the old fixtures myself, blasting a little classic rock through a Bluetooth speaker, and pretending I knew what I was doing. The strange part started on the 3rd week of renovations. I had just removed the cabinet under the sink when I noticed that the wall behind it didn't look quite right. The paneling sat slightly uneven compared to the rest, and when I knocked on it, it gave a dull, hollow sound. It was too small to hide anything major, maybe old wiring or a forgotten pipe access, but curiosity got the better of me. I fetched a screwdriver and pried it loose, expecting insulation or maybe a mouse nest. What I found instead was a narrow gap, barely wide enough for me to squeeze my shoulders through, leading into darkness. The air inside that space was thick and stale, like a basement that had been shut for decades. My flashlight beam shook against rough wooden beams and dust dancing in the light. The crawl space stretched about 8 feet deep, tapering toward the foundation, and right away I spotted something strange near the far end. A small pile of objects stacked neatly against the wall. Old photographs were scattered across the floor, black and white prints curled at the edges, and a faded pink dress small enough to fit a 6-year-old lay draped over a wooden crate. The sight stopped me mid-movement. Whoever had left these things there hadn't meant for them to be found. I crawled closer, brushing aside spider webs, and lifted one of the photos. It showed a group of children playing on a front lawn, their faces smudged with age but still visible. One girl had a distinctive birthmark across her cheek, shaped like a crescent moon. There were several more photos, birthday parties, school portraits, family snapshots, but none looked recent. Beneath them sat a sealed metal box about the size of a shoebox, heavy and cold to the touch. The latch was rusted but intact. I hesitated for a moment, then pried it open with my screwdriver, expecting old letters or coins. Instead, I saw several disposable flip phones lined up like artifacts in a museum. Each phone was labeled with a strip of masking tape, handwritten numbers, and faded blue ink across the backs. The batteries had been removed, but one of the compartments still held a SIM card. My flashlight caught a reflection off something scratched into the metal lid. 3 letters and a date so faint I could barely make them out. It looked like initials, maybe someone's way of keeping track. My first thought was that it belonged to the previous owner, some paranoid collector or amateur detective. But the more I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Why hide burner phones behind a wall? I brought the box into the kitchen, wiped my hands on my jeans, and sat on the dusty floor just staring at it. Curiosity overrode common sense. I turned one of the phones over in my hand, wondering if I could get it to power on. Most of the devices looked identical, the same cheap silver model popular in the early 2000s. The serial numbers were still legible though, etched into the plastic beneath the battery slots. Out of habit, I snapped a photo with my own phone, mostly because I wanted to figure out the brand later, maybe post about it on a repair forum. Later that night, I searched a few of the serial numbers online. It was just idle curiosity at first, but one of the results stopped me cold. The exact same sequence appeared in a scanned PDF of a local newspaper article, an old piece about an unsolved child abduction case from the same county. The article mentioned that authorities had found a disposable phone near the scene, its serial number partially linked to several others believed to be connected. I remember scrolling back and forth between my photo and the document multiple times, comparing every digit until there was no doubt. It was the same number. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house felt louder, more deliberate. The groan of settling wood, the tick of the refrigerator, even the wind pushing against the siding. When morning came, I decided to call the sheriff's office. I half expected them to dismiss me or tell me to drop the box off for evidence, but the woman who answered transferred me almost immediately to an investigator. He asked me to stay put and not touch anything until someone arrived. His tone wasn't casual. It carried the kind of clipped urgency that makes your heartbeat feel uneven. 2 deputies showed up less than an hour later, their patrol car crunching over the gravel driveway. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face and sunburned neck, introduced himself as Detective Lang. They asked me to walk them through everything, how I found the space, what I touched, and whether anyone else had been inside the house since I bought it. Lang kept glancing toward the crawl space like he already knew what they would find. When he finally crouched down and aimed his flashlight inside, he muttered something under his breath and asked his partner to photograph the area before moving anything. The next few hours blurred together. They collected the box, bagged the clothing, and took the photographs for evidence. I signed a short statement, then sat at my dining table while they made calls on their radios. One of them mentioned the name of a detective from an old task force, someone who had retired years ago, but had worked that abduction case. Hearing them say that out loud, confirming the connection, made the whole thing shift from eerie curiosity to something heavy and personal. That missing child had been around the same age as my niece. Over the following week, the sheriff's office kept in touch. They ran the serial numbers and confirmed several phones matched devices listed in old evidence logs. A local paper even ran a small update about new findings in a cold case but left my name out of it, thankfully. I tried to keep working on the house, but every hammer strike echoed through me like a pulse. I started avoiding the kitchen after dark. It was not the crawl space that bothered me anymore. It was the thought that someone had stood in that exact spot years ago, hiding those things piece by piece. About 10 days later, Detective Lang came back alone. He said the investigation was ongoing, but there was something else they had found. One of the phones still contained fragments of text messages recovered from a backup server. Short messages, mostly numbers and meeting points. He did not give me details, but his expression changed when I asked if they had found out who used the house before me. He told me quietly that the property had changed hands twice since the early 2000s, and that one of the prior owners had left abruptly, abandoning most of their belongings. That phrase stuck in my head long after he drove away. The house grew quieter after that visit, though not in a comforting way. I would wake in the middle of the night convinced I heard movement under the floorboards, soft and deliberate, like someone shifting their weight. I told myself it was the pipes or the settling foundation, but once you connect a home to a crime like that, every sound becomes suspect. I thought about selling, even called a realtor, but something held me back. It felt wrong to walk away before knowing the full truth. A few weeks later, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They had identified fingerprints on the inside of the metal box, prints belonging to one of the victim's family members. It turned out that the mother of the missing child had worked briefly for the family who owned my house decades earlier. She used to clean there on weekends, sometimes bringing her daughter along. The phones, the photos, even the clothing, they all connected to a time when several children vanished from nearby towns. They believed my crawl space had been used to hide communication devices between whoever orchestrated those disappearances. That revelation should have brought closure, but it did the opposite. Knowing that I had been living above a space once used for something that vile made the air in that kitchen impossible to breathe. I tore out the rest of the cabinets, had the entire crawl space sealed with concrete, and replaced the flooring. For a while, I tried to convince myself that normal life could return, that the house could still feel like mine. But even after repainting, reflooring, and filling the place with light, the silence underneath it never felt empty. Last month, I finally moved out. I did not bother selling the property. I just rented it out to a young couple who seemed thrilled by the low price. I told them about the renovations, not the history. Part of me wonders if I should have warned them, but another part hopes they never find that panel, or the things buried beneath it. I still drive by sometimes on my way home from work. The lights glow through the kitchen window now, warm and normal. Still, every time I pass I slow down just a little, half expecting to see that loose panel leaning open again.